The Day of the Jackal by Frederick Forsyth, with commentary by yours truly, Chopsticks McGuffin, aka Robert Jackson. Part 1. Anatomy of a Plot. 1. It is cold at 6:40 in the morning of a March day in Paris, and seems even colder when a man is about to be executed by firing squad. At that hour on March 11th, 1963, in the main courtyard of the Fort d'Ivry, a French Air Force colonel stood before a stake driven in the chilly ground as his hands were bound behind the post, and stared slowly with diminishing disbelief at the squad of soldiers facing him 20 meters away. A foot scuffed the grit, a tiny release from tension, as the blindfold was wrapped around the eyes of Lieutenant Colonel Jean-Marie Bastien Thierry, age 35, blotting out the light for the last time. The mumbling of the priest was a helpless counterpoint to the crackling of 20 rifle bolts as the soldiers charged and cocked their carbines. Beyond the walls, a brigade truck blared for passage as some smaller vehicle crossed its path towards the center of the city. The sound died away, masking the "Take your aim!" order from the officer in charge of the squad. The crash of rifle fire, when it came, caused no ripple on the surface of the waking city, other than to send a flutter of pigeons skyward for a few moments. The single whack, seconds later, from the coup de grace, was lost in the rising din of traffic from beyond the walls. The death of the officer, leader of a gang of secret army organization killers who had sought to shoot the president of France, was to have been an end to further attempts on the president's life. By quirk of fate, it marked the beginning, and to explain why, it is first necessary to explain why a riddled body came to hang from its ropes in the courtyard of the military prison outside Paris on that March morning. The sun had dropped at last behind the palace wall, and long shadows ripped across the courtyard, bringing a welcome relief. Even at 7 in the evening of the hottest day of the year, the temperature was still 25 degrees centigrade. Across the sweltering city, the Parisians, querulous wives and yelling children, into cars and trains to leave for the weekend in the country. It was August 22nd, 1962, the day a few men waiting beyond the city boundaries had decided that the president, General Charles de Gaulle, should die. While the city's population prepared to flee the heat for the relative cool of the rivers and beaches, the cabinet meeting behind the ornate facade of the Élysée Palace continued. Across the tan gravel of the front courtyard, now cooling in welcome shadow, 16 black Citroën DS sedans were drawn up nose to tail, forming a circle round 3/4 of the area. The drivers, lurking in the deepest shade close to the west wall where the shadows had first arrived, exchanged inconsequential banter of those who spent most of their working days waiting on their master's whims. There was more desultory grumbling at the usual length of the cabinet's deliberations, until a moment before 7:30, a chained and bemedaled usher appeared behind the plate glass doors at the top of the 6 steps of the palace and gestured toward the guards. Among the drivers, half-smoked Gauloises were dropped and ground into the gravel. The security men and guards stiffened their boxes beside the front gate, and massive iron grills were swung open. The chauffeurs were at the wheels of their limousines when the first group of ministers appeared behind the plate glass. The usher opened the doors, and the members of the cabinet straggled down the steps, exchanging a few last-minute wishes for a restful weekend. In order of precedence, the sedans eased up to the base of the steps. The usher opened the rear door with a bow. The ministers climbed into their respective cars and were driven away past the salutes of the Garde Républicaine and out into the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. Within 10 minutes they were gone. 2 long black DS-19 Citroëns remained in the yard, and each slowly cruised to the base of the steps. The first, flying the pennant of the President of the French Republic, was driven by Francois Maroux, a police driver from the training and headquarters camp of the Gendarmerie Nationale at Satori. His silent temperament had given him, apart from the joking of the ministerial drivers in the courtyard, his ice-cold nerves and ability to drive fast and safely kept him de Gaulle's personal driver. Apart from Maroux, the car was empty. Behind it, the second DS-19 was also driven by a gendarme from Satori. At 7:45, another group appeared behind the glass doors, and again the men on the gravel stiffened to attention. Dressed in his habitual double-breasted charcoal gray suit and tie, Charles de Gaulle appeared behind the glass. With old-world courtesy, he first ushered Madame Yvonne de Gaulle through the doors, then took her arm to guide her down the steps to the waiting Citroën. They parked at the car, and the president's wife climbed into the rear seat of the front vehicle on the left-hand side. The general got in behind her from the right. Their son-in-law, Colonel Alain de Boissieu, the then chief of staff of the armored and cavalry units of the French army, checked that both rear doors were safely shut, and then took his place in the front side beside Maroux. In the second car, two others from the group of functionaries who had accompanied the presidential couple down the steps, took their seats. Henri Desjouder, the hulking bodyguard of the day, a Kabyle from Algeria, took the front seat from behind the driver, eased the heavy revolver under his armpit, and slumped back. From then on, his eyes would flicker incessantly, not over the car in front, but over the pavements and street corners as they flashed past. After a last word to one of the duty security men to be left behind, the second man got into the back alone. He was Commissar Jean Ducret, chief of the Presidential Security Corps. From behind the west wall, two white-helmeted motorcyclists gunned their engines into life and rode slowly out of the shadows toward the gate. Before the entrance, they stopped 10 feet apart and glanced back. Maroux pulled the first Citroën away from the steps, swung towards the gate, and drew up behind the motorcycle outriders. The second car followed. It was 7:50 p.m. As the iron grille swung open and the small cortege swept past the ramrod guards into the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, and from there into the Avenue de Marigny. From under the chestnut trees, a young man in a white crash helmet astride a scooter watched the cortege pass, then slid away from the curb and followed. Traffic was normal for an August weekend, and no advance warning of the president's departure had been given. Only the whine of the motorcycle sirens told traffic cops on duty of the approach of the convoy, and they had to wave and whistle frantically to get the traffic stopped in time. The convoy picked up speed, and in the tree-darkened avenue, and erupted into the sunlit Place Clemenceau, heading straight across towards the Pont Alexandre III. Riding in the slipstream of the official cars, the scooterist had little difficulty in following. After the bridge, Maroux followed the motorcyclist into the Avenue General Gallieni, and thence into the broad Boulevard des Invalides. Some of these streets and buildings don't even exist anymore. I've maybe in the YouTube version or something, I can put up maps or something, but I know this is kind of difficult to follow. All right, back to it. And the Rue de Varennes, he eased back the screaming throttle and swerved towards a corner cafe. Inside, taking a small metal token from his pocket, he strode to the back of the cafe where the telephone was situated and placed a local call. Lieutenant Colonel Jean-Marie Bastien Thierry waited in the suburb of Moudon. He was married with 3 children, and he worked in the air ministry. Behind the conventional facade of his professional and family life, he nurtured a deep bitterness toward Charles de Gaulle, who he believed had betrayed France and the men who in 1958 had called him back to power by yielding Algeria to the Algerian nationalists. He personally had lost nothing through the loss of Algeria, and it was not personal consideration that motivated him. In his own eyes, he was a patriot, a man convinced that he would be serving his beloved country by slaying the man he thought had betrayed her. Many thousands shared his views at that time, but few in comparison were fanatical members of the secret army organizations, which had sworn to kill de Gaulle and bring down his government. Bastien Thierry was such a man. Now, what they're talking about here, I guess, are small cells inside of the French military. And I'm not sure why the French military is allowed to continue going this way, but I guess it's just because the French like to protest so much that it provides opportunities maybe for a coup to happen in case there is a really crooked government again or something. I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe the French people just, they love a good protest. Don't know. Bastien Thierry was such a man. He was sipping a beer when the call came through. The barman passed him on the phone, then went to adjust the television set at the other end of the bar. Bastien Thierry listened for a few seconds, muttered, "Very good, thank you," into the mouthpiece, and set it down. His beer was already paid for. He strolled out of the bar onto the pavement, took a rolled newspaper from under his arm, and carefully unfolded it twice. Across the street, a young woman let drop the lace curtain of her first floor flat, and, turning to the 12 men who lounged around the room, she said, "It's route number 2. The 5 youngsters, amateurs at the business of killing, stopped twisting their hands and jumped up. The other 7 were older and less nervous. Senior among them in the assassination attempt and second in command to Bastien Thierry was Lieutenant Alain Beaugrenet de la Tocnaie, an extreme fart-winger from a family of landed gentry. He was 35, married with 2 children. The most dangerous man in the room was Georges Watton, age 39, a bulky-shouldered, square-jowled OAS fanatic. Originally an agricultural engineer from Algeria, who in 2 years had emerged again as one of the OAS's most dangerous triggermen. From an old leg wound, he was known as the Limp. When the girl announced the news, the 12 men trooped downstairs via the back of the building to a side street, where 6 vehicles, all stolen or hired, had been parked. The time was 7:55. Bastien Thierry had personally spent days preparing the site of the assassination, measuring the angles of fire, speed and distance of the moving vehicles, and the degree of firepower necessary to stop them. The place he had chosen was a long, straight road called the Avenue de la Libération, leading up to the main crossroads of Petit Clermont. The plan was for the first group, containing the marksmen with their rifles, to open fire on the president's car some 200 yards before the crossroads. They would shelter behind an estafette van parked on the roadside, beginning their fire at a very shallow angle to the oncoming vehicles. By Bastien Thierry's calculations, 150 bullets should pass through the leading car by the time it came abreast of the van. With the presidential car brought to a stop, the second OAS group would sweep out of a side road to blast the security police vehicle at close range. Both groups would spend a few seconds finishing off the presidential party, then spring for the 3 getaway vehicles in another side street. Bastien Thiry himself, the 13th of the party, would be a lookout man. By 8:05, the groups were in position. 100 yards on the Paris side of the ambush, Bastien Thiry stood idly by a bus stop with his newspaper. Waving the newspaper would give the signal to Serge Bernier, leader of the 1st Commando, who would be standing by the estafette. He would pass the order to the gunman spread-eagled in the grass at his feet. Beaugrenet de la Tocnay would drive the car to intercept the security police, with Waton the limp beside him clutching a submachine gun. As the safety catches flicked off beside the road at Petit Clamart, General de Gaulle's convoy cleared the heavier traffic of central Paris and reached the more open avenues of the suburbs. Here the speed increased to nearly 60 miles an hour. As the road opened out, Francois Maroux flicked a glance at his watch, sensed the testy temperature of the old general behind him, and pushed the speed up even higher. The 2 motorcycle outriders dropped back to take up the station at the rear of the convoy. De Gaulle never liked such ostentation sitting out in front, and dispensed with them whenever he could. In this manner, the convoy entered the Avenue de la Division Leclerc at Petit Clamart. It was 8:17 p.m. A mile up the road, Bastien Thiry was experiencing the effects of his big mistake. He would not learn of it until told by the police as he sat months later in death row. Investigating the timetable of his assassination, he had consulted a calendar to discover that dusk fell on August 22nd at 8:35, seemingly plenty late enough, even if de Gaulle was late on his usual schedule, as indeed he was. But the calendar at the Air Force, the calendar the Air Force colonel had consulted related to 1961. On August 22nd, 1962, dusk fell at 8:10. Those 25 minutes were to change the history of France. At 8:18, Bastien Thiry discerned the convoy hurtling down the Avenue de la Libération towards him at 70 miles per hour. Frantically, he waved his newspaper. Across the road and 100 yards down, Bernier peered angrily through the gloom at the dim figure behind the bus stop. "Has the colonel waved his paper yet?" he asked of no one in particular. The words were hardly out of his mouth when he saw the sharp nose of the president's car flash past the bus stop into vision. "Fire!" he screamed to the men at his feet. They opened up as the convoy came abreast of them, firing with a 90-degree layoff at a moving target, passing them at 70 miles per hour. That the car took 12 bullets at all was a tribute to the killer's marksmanship. Most of those hit the Citroën from behind. 2 tires shredded under the fire, and although they were self-sealing tubes, the sudden loss of pressure caused the speeding car to lurch and go into a front-wheel skid. That was when Francois Maroux saved de Gaulle's life. Okay, here's where I'm pretty sure this part of the book is sort of loosely based in real events that happened. There was really an attempt on Charles de Gaulle's life, and a Citroën. I'm not be saying that wrong. I don't know. I'm sorry if anybody fans of Citroën out there. But they made this car that had the ability to drive, just straight up drive on three wheels. So, like, somehow by shifting the shocks or the balance inside, it did not need all three wheels, even though it was a rectangle. I mean, it did not need all four wheels if it didn't have to need them. And so the car got a lot of smoke back in those days for being seemingly like a sedan that was that unstoppable. Anyway, while the ace marksman, ex-legionnaire Varga, cut up the tires, the remainder emptied their magazines at the disappearing rear window. Several slugs passed through the bodywork, and one shattered the rear window, passing within a few inches of the presidential nose. In the front seat, Colonel de Boisseau turned and reared, "Get down!" and roared, "Get down!" at his parents-in-law. Madame de Gaulle lowered her head towards her husband's lap. The general gave vent to a frosty, "What again?" and turned to look out of the back window. Maru held the shuddering steering wheel and gently turned into the skid, easing down the accelerator as he did so. After a momentary loss of power, the Citroën surged forward again towards the intersection of the Avenue des Bois, the side road where the second commando of OAS men waited. Behind Maru, the security car clung to his tail, untouched by any bullets at all. For Bourgogne de la Tocnaie, waiting with engine running in the Avenue des Bois, the speed of the approaching cars gave him a clear choice: to intercept and commit suicide as the hurtling metal cut him to pieces, or let the clutch in a half second too late. He chose the later. As he swung his car out of the side road and into line with the presidential convoy, it was not de Gaulle's car he came alongside, but that of the marksman bodyguard de Joder and Commissar Ducret. Leading from the right-hand side window, outside of the car from waist up, Waton emptied his submachine gun at the back of the DS in front, in which he could see de Gaulle's haughty profile through the smashed glass. "Why don't those idiots fire back?" de Gaulle asked querulously. De Joder was trying to get a shot at the OAS killers across 10 feet of air between the two cars, but the police driver blocked his view. Ducret shouted to the driver to stick with the president, and a second later, the OAS were left behind. The two motorcycle outriders, one having nearly been unseated by de la Tocnaie's sudden rush out of the side road, recovered and closed up. The whole convoy swept into the roundabout and road junction, crossed it, and continued towards Villacoblet. At the ambush site, OAS men had no time for recriminations. They were to come later. Leaving the three cars used in the operation, they leapt aboard the getaway vehicles and disappeared into the descending gloom. From his car-borne transmitter, Commissar Ducret called Villacoblet and told them briefly what had happened. When the convoy arrived 10 minutes later, General de Gaulle insisted on driving straight to the apron where the helicopter was waiting. As the car stopped, a surge of officers and officials surrounded it, pulling open the doors to assist a shaken Madame de Gaulle to her feet. From the other side, the general emerged from the debris and shook glass splinters from his lapel. Ignoring the panicky solitude of the surrounding officers, he walked round the car to take his wife's arm. "Come, my dear, we are going home," he told her, and finally gave the Air Force staff his verdict on the OAS. "They can't shoot straight." With that, he guided his wife into the helicopter and took his seat behind her. He was joined by de Joder, and they took off for a weekend in the country. On the tarmac, Francois Maru sat ashen-faced behind the wheel. Both tires along the right-hand side of the car had finally given out, and the DS was riding on its rims. Ducre muttered a quiet word of congratulations to him, then went on with the business of clearing up. While the journalists the world over speculated on the assassination attempt, and for lack of anything better filled their columns with personal conjectures, the French police, headed by the Sûreté Nationale and backed up by the Secret Service and the Gendarmerie, launched the biggest police operation in French history. Soon it was to become the biggest manhunt the country had yet known, only later to be surpassed by the manhunt for another assassin whose story remains unknown, but is still listed in the files by his code name, the Jackal. They got their first break on September the 3rd, and as is so often the case with police work, it was a routine check that had brought results. Outside the town of Valence, south of Lyon, on the main road from Paris to Marseille, a police roadblock stopped a private car containing 4 men. They had stopped hundreds that day to examine identity papers, but in this case, one of the men in the car had no papers on him. He claimed he had lost them. He and the other 3 were taken to Valence for routine questioning. At Valence, it was established that the other 3 in the car had nothing to do with the 4th, apart from having offered him a lift. They were released. The 4th man's fingerprints were taken and sent to Paris, just to see if he was who he said he was. The answer came back 12 hours later. The fingerprints were those of a 22-year-old deserter from the Foreign Legion, who faced charges under military law. But the name he had given was quite accurate. Pierre Denis Magad. Magad was taken to the headquarters of the Service Régional of the Police Judiciaire at Lyon. While waiting in an anteroom for interrogation, one of the police guarding him playfully asked, "Well, what about Petit Clement?" Magad shrugged helplessly. "All right," he answered. "What do you want to know?" As stunned police officers listened to him and stenographers' pens scratched across one notebook after another, Magad sang for 8 hours. By the end, he had named every one of the participants of Petit Clement, and 9 others who had played smaller roles in the plotting stages or in procuring the equipment. 22 in all. The hunt was on, and this time the police knew whom they were looking for. In the end, only one escaped, and he has never been caught to this day. Georges Wotton got away and is presumed to be living in Spain along with most of the other OAS chiefs. The interrogation and preparations of the charges against Bastien Thierry, Beaugrenay de la Tocnay, and the other leaders of the plot were finished by December, and the group went on trial in January 1963. While the trial was on, the OAS gathered its strength for another all-out attack on the Gaullist government, and the French Secret Service fought back tooth and claw. Under the present norms of Parisian life, beneath the veneer of culture and civilization, one of the bitterest and most sadistic underground wars of modern history was fought out. The French Secret Service is called the Service de Documentation Extérieure et de Contre-Espionnage, known for short as SDECE. That's what we're going to be calling it, by the way. Yeah. Its duties are both those of espionage outside France and counter-espionage within, though each service may overlap the other's territory on occasion. Service 1 is pure intelligence, subdivided into bureaux, known by the initial R for renseignement, information. Those subdivisions are R1, intelligence analysis, R2, Eastern Europe, R3, Western Europe, R4, Africa, R5, Middle East, R6, Far East, R7, America/Western Hemisphere. Service 2 is concerned with counter-espionage. 3 and 4 comprise the communist section in one office. 6 is finance, and 7 administration. Service 5 has a one-word title: Action. This office was the core of the anti-OAS war. From the headquarters in a complex of nondescript buildings off the Boulevard Mortier, close to the Porte des Lilas, a dingy suburb of northeast Paris, the 100 toughs of the Action Service went out to war. These men, mainly Corsicans, were trained to a peak of physical fitness, then taken to Satori camp, where the special section, shut off from the rest, taught them everything known about destruction. They became experts in fighting with small arms and in unarmed combat, karate and judo. They underwent courses in radio communication, demolition and sabotage, interrogation with and without the use of torture, kidnapping, arson, and assassination. Some spoke only French. Others were fluent in several languages and at home in any capital of the world. They had the authority to kill in the course of duty and often used it. As the activities of the OAS became more and more violent and brutal, the director of the SDECE, General Eugene Gibaud, finally took the muzzle off these men and let them loose on the OAS. Some of them enlisted in the OAS and infiltrated its highest councils. From there they were content to provide information on which others could act, and many OAS emissaries on missions into France or other areas where they were vulnerable to the police were picked up on information provided by the Action Service men inside the terrorist organization. On other occasions, wanted men could not be inveigled into France and were ruthlessly killed outside the country. Many relatives of OAS men who had simply disappeared believed ever after that the men had been liquidated by the Action Service. Not that the OAS needed lessons in violence. They hated the Action Service men, known as the Barbouzes, or bearded ones, because of their undercovered role, more than any policeman. In the last days of a struggle for power between the OAS and Gaullist authorities inside Algiers, the OAS captured 7 Barbouzes alive. Their bodies were later found hanging from balconies and lampposts, minus ears and noses. In this manner, the undercover war went on. And the complete story of who died under torture at whose hands, in which cellar, will never be told. The remainder of the Barbouzes stayed outside the OAS at the beck and call of the SDECE. Some of them had been professional thugs from the underworld before being enlisted, kept up their old contacts, and on more than one occasion enlisted the aid of their former underworld friends to do a particularly dirty job for the government. It was these activities that gave rise to talk in the France of a parallel, unofficial police, supposedly at the orders of one of President de Gaulle's right-hand men, M. Jacques Foucault. In truth, no parallel police existed. The activities attributed to them were carried out by the Action Service strong arms or temporarily enlisted gang bosses from the milieu. Corsicans, who dominated both the Paris and Marseille underworld and the Action Service, know a thing or two about vendettas. And after the slaying of the 7 Barbouzes of Mission C in Algiers, a vendetta was declared against the OAS. In the same manner as the Corsican underworld helped the Allies during the landings in the south of France in 1944 for their own ends, they later cornered most of the vice trade along with the Côte d'Azur as a reward. So in the early 60s, the Corsicans fought for France again in a vendetta with the OAS. Many of the OAS men who were Pieds Noirs, Algerian-born Frenchmen, Algeria is in Africa, and Algeria is in Africa, and it was like a colony of France for a long time. Um, and it got real brutal there. Lots of things were invented about espionage and terrorism in that part of northern Africa. Many of the OAS men who were Pieds Noirs, Algerian-born Frenchmen, had the same characteristics as the Corsicans, and at times the war was almost fratricidal. As the trial of Bastien Thiry and his fellows wore on, the OAS campaign also got underway. Its guiding light, the behind-the-scenes investigator of the Petit Clamart plot, was Colonel Antoine Argaud, a product of one of France's top universities, the École Polytechnique. Argaud had a good brain and dynamic energy. As a lieutenant under de Gaulle and the Free French, he had fought for the liberation of France from the Nazis. Later, he commanded a regiment of cavalry in Algiers. A short, wiry man, he was a brilliant but ruthless soldier, and by 1962 had become operations chief for the OAS in exile. Experienced in psychological warfare, he understood that the fight against Gaullist France had to be conducted on all levels, by terror, diplomacy, and public relations. As part of the campaign, he arranged for the head of the National Resistance Council, the political wing of the OAS, former French Foreign Minister Georges Bidault, to give a series of interviews to newspapers and television across Western Europe, to explain the OAS's opposition to General de Gaulle in respectable terms. Argaud was now putting use the fine intellect that had once made him the youngest colonel in the French army, and now made him the most dangerous man in the OAS. He set up for Bidault a series of interviews with major networks and newspaper correspondents, during which the old politician was able to put a cloak of sober rectitude over the less acceptable activities of the OAS thugs. The success of Bidault's Argaud-inspired propaganda operation alarmed the French government as much as the terror tactics and the wave of plastic bombs exploding in cinemas and cafes all over France. Then on February 14th, another plot to assassinate General de Gaulle was uncovered. The following day, he was due to give a lecture at the École Militaire on the Champ de Mars. The plot was that on entering the hall, he was to be shot in the back by an assassin perched among the eaves of the adjacent block. Those who later faced trial for the plot were Jean Bicnon, a captain of artillery named Robert Poignard, and an English language teacher at the military academy, Madame Paule Rousselet de Lifiac. The trigger man was to have been Georges Watan, but once again the limp got away. A rifle with sniper scope was found at Poignard's flat, and the three were arrested. It was stated at the later trial that, seeking a way to spirit Watan and his gun into the academy, they had consulted Warrant Officer Marius Tho, who had gone straight to the police. General de Gaulle duly attended the military ceremony at the appointed time on the 15th, but made the concession of arriving in an armored-plated car, to his great distaste. As a plot, it was amateurish beyond belief, but it annoyed de Gaulle. Summoning Interior Minister Frey the next day, he hammered the table and told the minister responsible for national security, "This assassination business has gone far enough." It was decided to make an example of some of the top OAS conspirators to deter the others. Frey had no doubts about the outcome of of the Bastien-Thiry trial still going on in the Supreme Military Court. For Bastien-Thiry was at pains to explain from the dock why he thought Charles de Gaulle should die. But something more in the way of a deterrent was needed. On February 22nd, a copy of a memorandum which the director of Service 2 counter-espionage. Service 2 of SDECE had sent the letter to Interior Minister landed on the desk of the head of the Action Service. Here is an extract. We have succeeded in ascertaining the whereabouts of one of the main ringleaders of the subversive movement, namely ex-colonel of the French army Antoine Argaud. He has fled to Germany and intends, according to information from our intelligence service there, to remain for several days. This being so, it should be possible to get at Argaud and perhaps seize him. As the request made by our official counter-espionage service to the competent German security organizations has been refused, and these organizations now expect our agents to be on the heels of Argaud and other OAS leaders, the operation must, insofar as it is directed against the person of Argaud, be carried out with maximum speed and discretion. The job was handed over to the Action Service. In the mid-afternoon of February 25, Argaud arrived back in Munich from Rome, where he had been meeting other OAS leaders. Instead of going straight to Unertelstrasse, he took a taxi to the Edenwolf Hotel, where he had booked a room, apparently for a meeting. He never attended it. In the hall, he was accosted by two men who spoke to him in faultless German. He presumed they were German police and reached into his breast pocket for his passport. He felt both arms grabbed in a vice-like grip. His feet left the ground, and he was whisked outside to a waiting laundry van. He lashed out and was answered with a torrent of French oaths. A horny hand chopped across his nose, and another slammed him in the stomach. A finger felt for the nerve spot below the ear, and he went out like a light. I don't know. Since this is like a year zero book set back in the 60s, this is like, back Jason Bourne, all this. This is early spy stuff. So like all the cool martial arts stuff. I'm not really sure if you could just squeeze somebody behind the ear and they'll go out. Anyway, 24 hours later, a telephone rang in the Brigade Criminelle of the Police Judiciaire at 36 Quai des Orfèvres in Paris. A hoarse voice told the answering desk sergeant that he was speaking for the OAS and that Antoine Argaud, nicely tied up, was in a van parked behind the building. A few minutes later, the door of the van was jerked open, and Argaud stumbled out into a circle of dumbfounded police officers. His eyes, bandaged for 24 hours, would not focus. He had to be helped to stand. His face was covered with dried blood from a nosebleed, and his mouth ached from the gag, which the police pulled out of it. When someone asked him, "Are you Colonel Antoine Argaud?" he mumbled, "Yes." Somehow the Action Service had speared him across the frontier during the previous night, and the anonymous phone call to the police about the parcel waiting them in their own parking lot was just their private sense of humor at work. Argaud was held until June 1968, and then released. But one thing the Action Service men had not counted on. In removing Argaud, despite the enormous demoralization this had caused in the OAS, they had paved the way for his shadowy deputy, the little-known but equally astute Lieutenant Colonel Marc Roldan. Roldan? Roldan to assume command of operations aimed at assassinating de Gaulle. In many ways, it was a bad bargain. On March 4, the Supreme Military Court delivered its verdict on Jean-Marie Bastien Thierry. He and 2 others were sentenced to death, as were a further 3 still at large, including Watan the Limp. On March 8, General de Gaulle listened for 3 hours in silence to appeals for clemency by the lawyers of the condemned men. He commuted 2 of the death sentences to life imprisonment, but Bastien Thierry's condemnation stood. That night his lawyer told the Air Force colonel of the decision. "It is fixed for the 11th, he told his client. And when the latter continued to smile disbelievingly, he blurted out, "You are going to be shot." Bastien Thierry kept smiling and shook his head. "You don't understand," he told the lawyer. "No squad of Frenchmen will raise their rifles against me." Now, he was wrong. The execution was reported on the 8 a.m. news of Radio Europe #1 in French. It was heard in most parts of Western Europe by those who cared to tune in a small hotel room in Austria. The broadcast was to set off a train of thoughts and actions that brought General de Gaulle nearer to death than at any time in his career. The room was that of Colonel Marc Roldan, new operations chief of the OAS. All right, folks, that's chapter 1. Thank you for listening. I hope you come back for number 2 of this project, Wepwawet.